Hey everyone, as you can see, I'm away from the office. I'm in Nashville attending an awesome conference for the next few days, but I did want to chime in on the countdown clock that has begun for Brexit. We are in the final hours, counting down to 11 p.m. Friday night, January 31st. It's really just amazing that we've come this far, and I wanted to sweeten the countdown for all of us with a video on precisely why Brexit is the beginning of the end of the EU. There's just no way around it. The question remains not if the EU will fall, but merely when. And so what I want to do is give you a big picture overview of why this countdown to Brexit is really just a microcosm of the macro countdown to the fall of the EU. And I bring this up because there are a lot of commentaries and pundits out there arguing that the EU is going to, well, it's just going to survive just fine, you know. It's most certainly a setback. As the New York Times called it, Brexit is what they call a Texas-sized setback, but the EU is much needed and it will spring back from all of this better and stronger than ever. And in my estimation, you know, that's all just a bunch of whistling past the graveyard. And I think we all know that. Whether it's the proponents of the EU like it or not, the EU is part of this world. And therefore, we have to understand Brexit in light of larger political and cultural trajectories going on all over the world. All we have to do is ask ourselves, what's characterizing the world we live in right now, if you think it through? Is it increasing centralization, or are we seeing a noticeable trend towards secession and decentralization, right? Are we moving more and more united around globalized standards and protocols, or are we beginning to break apart and go independent, as it were? What scholars are noticing is that the modernist globalist propensity towards collectivization and standardization is breaking apart. Just ask the Soviet Union. It's gone about as far as it can go. And now the globalist world as a whole is cracking up. So I think it's imperative to see Brexit as part of a much larger trend towards massive worldwide balkanization. The world in many ways is coming undone. So we're seeing cracks quite literally everywhere in the old globalist world order and the breaking away of nations from that order. So for example, it might surprise you to learn that since 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, there have been over 35 nations added to the world map. I mean, you have to let that hit you. In a matter of just 30 years, we're seeing the formation of 35 new nations on the international stage. If the world was becoming more globalist, it would be becoming more consolidated, but in a terrible blow to the future of globalism and its propensity towards standardization and centralization. The world is not consolidating. It's actively resisting that consolidation, and it's actually cracking up in a good sense. The world is splitting apart. It's going through a massive international fission, like a big bang exploded in our midst, and the various nations of the world are all sort of splitting away from a centralized, globalized world. So from Lithuania to Bosnia to Chechnya, Rwanda, Burundi, Quebec, South Sudan, Slovenia, Scotland, Catalonia, and of course now Britain via the EU, populations have been turning increasingly inward for civic and cultural identity and turning away from transnational centralization, standardization, which is increasingly seen as detrimental to the distinctives of a nation's customs, cultures, and traditions, which are so indispensable to life and that they uniquely make up what Jordan Peterson calls maps of meaning for populations, without which the population ultimately ceases to exist. Again, you might be surprised to know, but scholars, particularly anthropologists, have found that culture is essential to human adaptation and survival. Culture functions very much like an immune system for the social order of populations. And we've talked about this on a number of our videos, but social orders, if they're going to survive, they have to maintain an equilibrium of power relations between the various institutions and structures in the social nexus. Otherwise, they simply fall apart. And in order to maintain that social equilibrium, populations have to have culture. They have to have a symbolic system of rules, understandings, and goals that are considered sacred and unquestionable and absolute. So for example, in a little league baseball game, okay, for you baseball fans, you parents out there, there are a number of givens, right? There are a number of symbolic rules, understandings, and goals that all the players, coaches, and parents share. This is what gives the game its form, its character. And what this means is that if the umpire calls a runner out, the runner can't respond by complaining, "Who the heck are you to say that?" Right? The answer, of course, is that he's the umpire. He's the ordained enforcer of rules. He'll be wearing a special uniform that symbolizes that culturally derived ordination. And without such an enforcer, without some kind of system of enforcement, all the rules would collapse and baseball, at least in this circumstance, would cease to exist. The umpire has to have ultimate authority over the game, one that even coaches and parents have to comply with, if there's to be any baseball at all. This is the way culture functions. As long as you have a healthy and vibrant culture, the population continues to exist. Once the culture breaks down, the population scatters. And so it's no coincidence that in a globalized world, a globalized system that destroys cultures, customs, and traditions, it is no coincidence that we're seeing a mass scattering of populations all over the world, right? Does that make sense? We're seeing mass migration at levels not seen since World War II, and that's largely because we're living in the midst of a globalist world system that, in the technical term, disembeds time and space away from localized control and thus hollows out and erodes localized cultures, customs, and traditions, and thereby creates a sense of homelessness, which in turn inspires this mass worldwide movement of populations, the vast majority of which are coming into the West. And so if culture is so indispensable to our survival as distinct populations, what do you think is happening all over the world now that more and more populations recognize that globalism is putting their very survival at risk? What do you think's happening? What's happening, and it's been happening now since the 1990s, what's happening is the world is beginning to rebel. And it's rebelling by reasserting its borders, its nationhood, its historic religion, its historic culture, and all the hallmarks of a population civilization are being reawakened to challenge and indeed destroy globalism's threat. So the upshot of all this is that Brexit is part of this worldwide cultural upheaval where more and more populations are rebelling against this globalist world order and are doing so by re-embracing their nation, culture, customs, and traditions as mechanisms of resistance against this anti-cultural globalized world order and its secular aristocracy. So all of that is to say that I don't see how the EU ultimately survives this. The EU is a modern relic. It's a massive fossil that no longer finds a hospitable habitat in an increasingly nationalist, populist, and indeed traditionalist world. And there's really nothing that anyone in the EU can do about it. I mean, these are trends that are so massive that we're not defining them, they're defining us. And these trends are nothing short of tectonic shifts moving the world far to the nationalist populist right. And as such, that tectonic shift, that earthquake, is bringing down a lot of globalist institutions like the Soviet Union and now most recently the EU. Now, before you go, I just uploaded on our channel Nigel Farage's amazing last speech to the bullies in Brussels. It will make you stand up and cheer. I think he speaks for all nationalist populists throughout the world. So enjoy your final day, your Brexit countdown with that video. Click on the link and I will see you over there. God bless and happy Brexit.